Good evening. Welcome. This is the first time we've held one of these conversations in the Great Choir. As you can tell, there's a large event that will take place in the Cathedral tomorrow, and so we thought it would be a little bit more intimate up here. So thank you for being with us. For all of you who are looking sideways, God bless you. I'm sitting in those stalls, but make sure you all can see. I hope you can, and we'll test our microphones to make sure you can hear us as well. My name's Randy Hollerith. I'm the Dean of Washington National Cathedral, and on behalf of Dr. Meeks and David Brooks, we're so glad that you're here with us tonight. There are many excellent institutions in this city that bring people together to talk about any variety of topics: leadership, public service, public policy, foreign policy, politics in general, you name it. All of these are important conversations, but we wanted to do something slightly different here at the Cathedral. Something that could highlight the importance of faith and the spiritual life in conjunction with public service and leadership. This year, we are focused on the theme of healing the soul of the nation. At a time when we are more divided than ever, ideologically, economically, politically, socially, what will it take to bring about healing, reconciliation, justice? Is it even possible? In January, we discussed healing the economy, and tonight our focus is on what it would take to heal our society. I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Catherine Meeks and David Brooks as our guests for this important conversation. So thank you for being here, and at the end of the conversation, or near the end, after 8 o'clock, we will begin to take some questions from the audience. So if you have questions, prepare yourself with your question. And for all of you who are joining us by way of the internet, thank you so much for being with us. I think we have a crowd of almost 600 that signed up to be on the internet with us tonight. Please feel free to drop your question into the YouTube chat. Did I say that right? YouTube chat. And we'll be monitoring that chat, looking for your questions. I invite you, if prayer is an important part of your life, to take a moment and join me in a prayer, the prayer of St. Francis, which is one of my favorites. Let us pray. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. As we begin tonight, I want to take just a moment to formally introduce both of our speakers and tell you a little bit about them. Dr. Catherine Meeks is Executive Director of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing in the Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta, Georgia. She is a sought-after teacher and worship leader, and Catherine brings 4 decades of experience to her work of racial healing. She is the retired Clara Carter Acree Distinguished Professor of Sociocultural Studies from Wesleyan College and the founding Executive Director of the Lane Center for Community Engagement and Service. The core of her work has been with people who have been marginalized because of economic status, race, gender, or physical ability. This work grows out of her understanding of her call to the vocation of teacher, as well as her realization that all of humanity is one family which God desires to unite. She is the author of several books, including her co-authored Passionate for Justice, Ida B. Wells, A Prophet for Our Times. David Brooks is an op-ed columnist at the New York Times and chair of WEAVE, the Social Fabric Project at the Aspen Institute. He is the author of, most recently, The Second Mountain, The Quest for a Moral Life, as well as Bobos in Paradise, The Social Animal, and the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Road to Character. Previously, David Brooks was a senior editor at the Weekly Standard and held several posts at the Wall Street Journal. A contributing writer at The Atlantic, David commentates on the PBS NewsHour, NPR's All Things Considered, and NBC's Meet the Press. Welcome to you both. Thank you for being with us tonight. Let's start with a very general question for both of you so that you can both introduce to all of us exactly the work that you're doing. Catherine, tell us something about the Absalom Jones Center, how it came about, what its role is, and how you got to be a part of it.
Thank you. It's really good to be here, and especially to be here with David. I've teased David about being a David Brooks groupie, so I'm very happy to have this opportunity, David. The Absalom Jones Center is named after the first African American who was ordained as a priest in the Episcopal Church. It only took him like 9 years to get ordained because there was so much reluctance to ordaining a Black person. So because we bear his name, we believe we have a huge responsibility to be about the business of truly telling the best truth we can tell and being the best representative of the possibility for us to heal ourselves in terms of racism in this country. We are a collaborative project between the diocese, the Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta, and the big church, the Episcopal Church, which Michael Curry heads. So that we are part of the larger Episcopal community, but we started in the Diocese of Atlanta. We have a primary focus, and it is the mobilization of our churches to get churches to step up to the plate, to be doing the work of racial healing, which is actually the work the church is supposed to be doing anyway. We really should not have to have a separate organization to do that work, because that is the work, part of the work of the church. I've been doing this work since I was really young, because I grew up in a place where I was told that I had to be a second-class citizen and I couldn't be a human being, the human being that I wanted to be. And there was something in me that never believed that. And so I stood against that as a little kid and as a teenager and all throughout my life. And as an adult, I became a professor and taught a lot of stuff about African American studies and prejudice and all of that. But as a Christian, I understood a very essential point, and that was that there were not any people on this planet that I could exclude. And as a Black woman, that was a big march to take, to be willing to include white folks in my reality. And I had to learn about that, and there were some white people who helped me do that. And I've come to the understanding that we do, in fact, have to accept everybody as a beloved child of God, and that is not a negotiable. No matter if you're Black, brown, or white, it's not a negotiable. And so the Center for Racial Healing operates out of that premise, and we have tried very hard to make that clear by being very inclusive of all of the oppressed groups in this country, and not just get stuck on African Americans or Native Americans or Latinos. We don't get to pick and choose. And the Center for Racial Healing is here to make that proclamation that we have to be inclusive and we have to be ready to tell the best truth we can tell, and we don't compromise on that. So when we first got started, people told me that if we didn't talk about dismantling racism, folks would give us money more readily. And I said, then I don't want their money if they don't understand what we're really trying to do, because we do intend to dismantle racism. And so if you give us our money, you need to understand that, because I don't really have time to waste, and I don't think anybody else does either. So our center is not about trying to sugarcoat anything. We're not responsible for making people feel good. We're responsible for telling the best truth we can tell, and the truth should set people free. And if you're free, you ought to feel better. And that's it. I mean, that's pretty much, you know, we have created a space we're located in Atlanta, Georgia, across the street from the historical black colleges, Morehouse, Spelman, Clark Atlanta University, Morris Brown, all of those lovely schools. We're situated in a black community that's been hit by, we call it renewal, gentrification, or whatever, but it ends up to be deconstruction and dismantling is what it ends up to be. And we're in the midst of that, and we're trying to be responsible in that place. And I'm there because my soul has to do this work. That's all. That's enough.
What a blessing it is.
Thank you.
David, tell us about Weave.
We've started in 2018 or so, or at least the thought of it. Every column I was writing got down to social breakdown and social distrust, whether it was political polarization, rising depression rates, rising suicide rates. And so we seem to be in some sort of deeper spiritual crisis and social crisis than any I had lived through. And so it seemed like one of those Pearl Harbor moments where you should try to do something extra. And so we co-founded Weave, and the idea was that this problem of social distrust and social breakdown is being solved at the local level in every neighborhood in America by people we call weavers. And we would just go to an area and say, who's trusted here? And so there was a lady in Florida we met she helps the kids from the elementary school walk across the street. And we asked her, do you have time to volunteer in your neighborhood? And she said, no, I have no time. And we said, well, are you being paid to help the kids cross the street? She said, no. And then we said, well, what do you do after you do this? She says, well, on Thursdays, I take food to the hospitals. Do you have time to volunteer? No, I have no time to do that. For her, this was just what being a neighbor was. And so when you go to talk to them, they send her to here. Here in Columbia Heights in DC, we ran into a guy, we said, who's trusted here? It turns out there's some Ethiopian guy who takes money at one of the parking garages who has an obsession with understanding DC zoning rules. So if you have a problem with the city, you go to the guy in the parking garage. So he's a weaver there. We ran into a guy in Houston, Pancho Arguelles, who runs something called, or just left it, but ran something called Living Hope Wheelchair Association. Took men, mostly undocumented immigrants who had broken their back and become paralyzed while working on construction jobs. And he would give them diapers and catheters and wheelchairs and things they needed to live a dignified life. And then he'd organize them into community workers. So you're in a neighborhood in Houston, and 25 Latino guys in wheelchairs roll in your neighborhood to help you out. And Pancho is just one of the most beautiful people I've ever met. I once said to him, Pancho, you radiate holiness. And he said to me, no, I reflect holiness, which was the right answer. So at Weave, we don't do the work, we support those who are doing the work. We try to lift them up, tell their stories, give them opportunities to tell their own stories, and now occasionally some financial support. And before I forget, I'm going to introduce some of the members of the Weave team, if they would stand up. Please, yes. Our Executive Director, Fred Riley. You can say hi, Francis Kraft. Michael Scholar somewhere in the house. And an alumni, Luke Phillips, is somewhere here. There he is, way in the back. Thanks for being so social, Luke. So
welcome, we're glad you're here.
Yeah, so please, and I should say, just finally in closing, this is my first time in 40 years being in an Episcopal choir, but it's not my first time in life. Because I grew up in one of these Jewish homes. Some people are familiar with the warm and huggy Jewish homes, where there's always emoting. I came from the other kind of Jewish home. So the phrase in our family was, think Yiddish, act British. And so it was, you want to be the stiff upper lip. So to train me in this culture, they sent me to Grace Church School in Lower Manhattan. And back when I was 10 or 12, I had a voice. And so I was in the choir. And because it was in New York, the choir was about 40% Jewish. And so we would sing the hymns, but we wouldn't sing the word Jesus. And so the volume would drop down and then come back up. And then. So I will break out into Lord of the Dance now.
I want to hear you sing sometime, David, I really do.
That went away with puberty.
Well, before we can really talk about this broad topic of healing the soul of America, socially. Let's talk a little bit about what we think's making America sick. You know, what some of the core of the illness is, if we all agree that there is societal illness. So let me throw that out to both of you just to say a little bit about what you think some of the primary issues are as far as the lack of community, that social crisis that's going on, and the rise of racism in this country.
You want to start?
Okay. Well, some of the problems in America that Catherine's been speaking to have always been in this country, so it's not like something new happened. And so those fractures are long-standing and hopefully are being recognized a little more. I do think there have been a couple moments of cultural decline that have made this problem worse than it was for many populations. And that is, we used to have a culture that was just a more communal culture. It was a culture where you assumed you were going to grow up in a family and you were going to have an extended family around you, and you were just going to join neighborhood organizations. That was just assumed way you were going to live your life. And that assumption, that culture of we, went away sometime, I think, right after World War II. There's a sociologist, Robert Putnam, who has a book came out last year or two called The Upswing. And he has what he calls the me, we, me curve. And so he takes a whole bunch of social indicators from political polarization, wealth inequality, racial discrimination, gender justice, community activism, church attendance, active in community groups, bipartisan political activity. It was super low in the 1890s. All these social indicators were super low. They gradually rose and peaked in the 1950s. And then suddenly they dropped, and now they're super low again. Why would all these things, political giving, church attendance, charitable giving, racial equity, why would all these things follow the same curve? Because we started with a culture of me, me, me. We went to a culture of we, we, we. We decided, sometimes for good reason, that culture was sick in the 50s, that it was too conformist, it left too many people out. And so we smashed up that culture, and we decided the life I'm going to live is going to be about myself, and that the highest authority in my life is not going to be external to myself, either God or a community. It's going to be internal to myself, to my own individual conscience. And so the ultimate authority for many people went from outward to inward. And therefore the habits of deference and obedience and surrender to some organization or some faith, that went away. And the one thing I've been obsessing on recently is there was an assumption throughout American history that we're deeply broken pieces, and we're gloriously made but deeply broken. And therefore there has to be a tradition of moral formation. Either Christian formation, Jewish formation, but formation. You need moral education to be trained. And if you went to colleges in the 19th century, character formation was the key to the college. Character formation was the key to church. Character formation was the key to government. And so one of my heroes was Frances Perkins, who was the first woman in the cabinet, Secretary of Labor. She went to Mount Holyoke in a class of about 1905. Some of the rules of Mount Holyoke would not fly where I teach. Like some of the rules were freshmen must bow in the presence of sophomores. Freshmen must keep a restrained voice in the presence of upperclassmen. But the motto of Mount Holyoke was do what no one else wants to do, go where no one else wants to go. And in 1920, of the missionaries abroad, women in Africa and Asia, all around the world, something like 20% of them went to Mount Holyoke. It was just, these were schools for the promotion of a certain sort of moral life. Around about 1945, 50, you have all these books like The Power of Positive Thinking that come out and say, you're not sinful, you're good. You don't need moral formation. And so all these moral formation programs, whether it be the YMCA, the Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, they got out of the business of moral formation. They got into the business of let's help you get in touch with yourself. And so in my view, we've now had several generations of young people, and my students are wonderful. They've never been given a vocabulary to understand the improvement of their own moral lives, and they totally understand this. And so we've left them morally alone and frankly morally unskilled. What is moral formation? It sounds lofty, but mostly it's how do you sit with somebody who's grieving? How do you be a neighbor? How do you talk to someone who's considering suicide? How do you break up with someone without crushing them? These are specific skills. And in my view, a lot of people don't have these skills and therefore treat each other worse, and hence more depression, broken relationships, less relationship, more social distrust.
Let me ask you a follow-up question to that, Catherine, and then we'll jump to you. So I'm curious, you talked about the change from 1945 or so, the sort of the swing that started with at the end of the 50s, that it was too restrictive, too tied down. What happened from the 1890s to the 1900s? What happened that reversed that trend from the me to the we? Was it war? Was it finances? What do you, do they have theory about what caused that?
So at Weave, we spent a lot of time on social trust, and we're putting together a map of where social trust is strong and where it's weak. And so in the 1890s, we were a very low social trust society. 1950s, very high. Now, if you ask Americans, do you trust your neighbors? A generation ago, or 2 generations ago, do you trust your neighbors? 60% say yes. Right now, 30% say yes, including 19% of millennial and Gen Z. Wow. And so I asked all these social scientists, well, how do you build social trust? How do you turn it around? And they were like, I don't know, we've never seen it. So then I asked historians. And so they gave me an answer precisely to the question you just asked. And they say it happened in 3 waves. First, there was a religious and cultural shift. Basically, social Darwinism, highly individualistic, sharp elbow kind of ethos, was replaced by the social gospel movement. A much more communal ethos within churches around the country. So you had that. And then in the 1890s, you have a civic renaissance. You have the creation of all sorts of organizations, the Boys and Girls Scouts, the Boys and Girls Clubs, the NAACP, a lot of unions were founded then. You have all these organizations, the Settlement House movement, the environmental movement, the temperance movement. Basically, Americans looked around and said, all of our institutions for raising people are for raising kids on the prairie in Kansas. But we've got 1 million kids in Cleveland, we've got 1 million kids in Detroit. And so they founded all these organizations. So you had a big civic renaissance. And then eventually you had the progressive movement, a political movement. And so it went in the order of cultural, theological shift, civic renaissance, political shift. And if you go back, the one other time in history where this happened was England from 1813 to 1848. And once again, there was a religious revival, then there was bottom-up and top-down civic action, and then finally political. And that strikes me as a very plausible way it moves. But you have to change the culture, and we try to contribute a little to the change in culture, and we try to support the civic renaissance, because there really are, in every organization, every neighborhood, there are people starting new organizations, starting community-based, relationship-based work. And so it's our job to support with money and with resources and with moral support.
There's a lovely story about Carl Jung being out in well, actually it wasn't, yeah, it was Jung, out in West Africa, in Kenya, East Africa, on a pilgrimage. And one morning they got up to go, and all of the guides that were, they call them guides, they were really the pack folks carrying all the packs and stuff, nobody moved. Everybody sat there, and Jung said, what's going on? And they said, we have been running like crazy for all these days, and we've left our soul back there somewhere, and we're not moving until our souls catch up with us. So we've left our souls somewhere in the process of all these things you've just described, and we need to sit with ourselves and find a way to at least identify what we left behind, because we don't even really know anymore, I don't think. And our religious communities are so busy trying to not look too weird and want to be acceptable by the culture until we can't interrogate that either. And we want to be careful that we don't ruffle too many feathers. And I mean, we just got ourselves in a fix. And we need to sit down and let our souls catch up with us, because we have become a soulless people. You know, nobody should have to teach you to be kind to another person. I mean, that should not be a lesson you have to be taught. But we somehow have created an environment that has caused people to just get into, you know, the birds act better than we do.
Yeah.
You know, they really do. And so for me, I mean, I love that you carry all those facts in your head about the research, but for me, this is like an analysis of this issue that is really hard to get your hands on, because how do you talk about soul anyway, and what is that? And we don't teach anything. We don't teach people much of anything in our churches about how to really live in the world. We tell you to be forgiving and loving, but we don't tell you how you're supposed to do that. You know, how you're supposed to forgive. Well, first you got to work on what's going on inside of yourself and deal with yourself. You can't just wake up in the mornings and say, you slapped me in the face and I forgive you. That doesn't work. And if you're trying to make it work, then you're just covering up stuff. And we've got so much, we need to do inner and outer stuff, and we just want to jump over that. And so I think that we need to reimagine the paradigms, you know, and maybe the church, religious communities, and people who claim they have some sense about what is the truth need to try to sit down and see, what do we really have? I think we need to get over ourselves with some of the trying to be smart and trying to, you know, if we can outfox God. That's what looks like we're trying to do sometime, instead of just sitting down and confessing we just made a mess and we need some big help. So I want the soul in this. I want the restoration of soulfulness, and whatever that, you know, and I think we've got.
Is that the same thing as what David was saying about, and that each of these turns, historically, there have been some sort of a spiritual or religious revival? Is that the kind of thing that you think needs to happen?
Well, I think a lot of that stuff was just a bunch of junk covered up with religion that we did in churches and in religious communities. But where did we find where can we find real genuine transformation, where people really did start living into trying to be honest with each other and really caring and being inclusive? I don't know where we've done that. I mean, we've done a lot of coming up with stuff and then covering it up with religion. And I like to tell people, could you just leave God out of that mess? You know, because God is not about all of these political, social constructs that we interpret the scripture according to those political, social ways, rather than trying to really see what was really being said, because we don't like the message that was really there, so we fix it the way we want it. That's been part of the problem. So what can we find about the real truth of who it is God wants us to be? And I don't know, we don't ask that question enough, because we don't want to really hear the answer, because it's not going to fit with our previously construed notion of what reality is. We made up the world the way we wanted it to be, and then we set out to make it fit. And we use God to cover it all up, and I'm done with that. I want to say, let me sit here and try to hear the deeper message, even if I'm not going to like it, even if it's going to scare me.
Can I follow up on that soul point? Because I've spent the last 2 years thinking, we talk a lot about community, a lot about relationships, but that talk, if not corrected, can get a little too vague. Like, well, I'm for community. But the elemental moral act, and this is the book I'm writing, is the act of seeing you as a soul. And I mostly talk to secular audiences. I'll leave belief in God to you, that's your job. But I say each person has some piece of them that has no size, shape, color, or weight. It is of infinite value and dignity. And we're not equal on the level of our brain power or muscle power, but we're all equal on the level of our souls. And each person, I say, I don't care if you believe in God or not, believe that each person you meet is made in the image of God. And if you treat the person behind the counter as if they have a soul, if you treat them, the girl you're getting drunk with, as if she's made in the image of God, you'll probably end up treating them correctly. But then what I've been focusing on is how do you see that in each person? And so it's like a series of steps. Like the first step is the quality of attention you cast. That the essential moral act is how you cast attention on another human being. And the word I got from somewhere is illuminationism. God doesn't see us with cold, detached eyes. God illuminates us with the eyes of warm love. And I can cast an attention on you that's egotistical attention. I'm not really thinking about you because I'm thinking about myself. Or aloof attention because I'm insecure and I'm afraid of feelings. Or I can illuminate you with a loving attention. And then there's the process, Pope Francis has this of accompaniment, of how do we travel with each other in an other-centered manner. And an accompaniment is like a pianist is accompanying the singer, paying close attention to the singer, trying to make sure her song is more beautiful. And so there are these processes of the exact micro gifts or micro skills of making somebody feel heard and understood. And the big one, by the way, is conversation. We think we can empathize our way into another person's life. We're just not that good at it. They do research on this, and of course, being me, I know the research. When you're having a conversation, you think you understand what the other person is thinking. The average person is correct 22% of the time. With close family and friends, 35% of the time. We're just not that good at knowing what the other person is thinking because everyone is creating their own world based on their own depth. And so you have to ask them a question. And so it's the skill of asking easy questions. It's reversed, like we used to do, where do you get your name? But then deeper questions. Mac out there has a friend, I have a friend, Peter Block, who asks really deep questions like, what commitment have you made that you no longer believe in? What forgiveness are you withholding? How does fear show up in your life? And these are, once you get to know someone, these are questions that really make the full humanity of the person come alive. And so that I've been thinking really on the micro scale of how does that work.
But until you do some of that interrogating of yourself, you can't do it to somebody outside of yourself and have it be something that's going to work, because then you just are being a voyeur. You haven't done the work. And we don't, and so I think people have to be invited into,
right.
If I want to know about you, I best be interested in trying to know about myself too.
Yeah.
And not using you as somebody that I just project onto, and then I live my life sort of vicariously through my projections,
right.
rather than I'm really in sync with you. I understand something about your suffering because I'm in touch with my suffering, rather than I use your suffering as an excuse to keep from dealing with mine.
Right. Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of projection that goes on where people aren't so not in touch with themselves, but they're just making up a world out here and then relating to this world, kind of like Plato's cave, you know,
right.
You're looking at shadows on the wall and you think that's reality, but it's just shadows of something that's not even real because you're just making it all up. So how do we get to a point where we are willing to do the work that is required so that we can actually relate to somebody and see them? How are you going to see me, you know?
Yeah.
How are you going to see me if you don't see yourself?
Yeah, but I'm too scared of what I might find in myself, so I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
No, I find it's dialogical. In order to behold someone, you have to be willing to be beheld.
That's right.
And so I was in a conversation with a little group at dinner, and we were saying, how have our ancestors formed us?
Yeah.
What do we carry from centuries ago, the cultures and contributions of our ancestors? And that was something I wouldn't have thought about unless I could do it in a group where we could compare.
Yeah.
And there's a Jewish tradition that when we're arguing to find the disagreement under the disagreement. So we disagree about something, but why are we really disagreeing? And when you do that, it becomes a dialogue of, well, let's find out what we really disagree about. And it's a way of clarifying our own minds. Because I find each person is so deep. I used to have this phrase, I used the big shaggy, like the deep unconscious. And a lot of what we do for reasons we know not of.
That's right.
And with other people, you can begin to interrogate that and to see what's going on down there. Like there's a program at Weave we ran into called Becoming a Man. And what they do is they take gang members in Chicago and they have them check in emotionally, physically, but then they have a phrase, a key question they ask, which is, why is that a problem for you? If somebody overreacts and is triggered by something, they stop and they say, why is that a problem for you? What happened in your past that makes that a problem? And that's the kind of dialogue that at least I'm too scared to write a journal.
And the truth telling that's necessary.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the truth telling part is, can we tell the truth? Can I tell the truth to myself? And I'm right now really exploring this whole business of what does it mean to have purity of heart? You know, what does that mean? I mean, I can think my heart's pure, but then what comes up out of me? So am I willing to really face what comes up and look at it and say, good Lord, where did that come from? You know, and just own it rather than pushing it back down or giving it to somebody. You know, my classic example of this is like, I buy the stuff I don't have any business eating and I say it's for my son, he's gonna eat this, but I know I'm really gonna be the one to eat it because I'm not telling myself the truth about this at all. I know I don't need to be eating it, so I'm not gonna own it. But getting to the, you know, that's just a silly little thing, but we do that about so much stuff. So, and then we do it collectively, because we kind of all agree as a culture, we're gonna come together in these groups and this is gonna be the way we're gonna be, and we're kind of gonna lie to each other, you know. I wonder what would happen, you know, if everybody just on Sunday morning, if folks who gather, particularly in our churches, if people just came in and really told the truth about where they really were, how they really felt, what was going on with them.
Well, they always say that the best Sunday morning is an AA meeting.
Yeah, where you're telling.
You're just telling each other the truth and just, yeah, exactly. So I'm going to jump in and ask a question, or else I'm going to go sit out there because I'm not very necessary.
I'm sorry, Randy.
Which is wonderful. I'm loving every second of this.
You can have the night
off.
off.
I love it. I love every second of it. So, you know, we're talking about trust, building trust, seeing one another, having conversation, deep conversation. And your beautiful sermon yesterday about being made well. Do you want to be made well? And I can't help but ask, when it comes to the issue of race in this country, how much of America do you think really wants to be made well?
No, not much. I don't think the church does either, unfortunately. And I keep hoping, because I'm a Christian, and other communities of faith, I hope it would happen there too. But I think we like the world we've created. I do believe that. You know, we set up the hierarchies, we devalue people. Do we all want everybody to have equality? Do we really want people to have equality? Do we really want people to have everything that they need? We get into, well, I worked hard for mine and you didn't work that hard, so we start that hierarchical stuff. We like that. So I think that we don't really want the world to change much, which is why it doesn't change. We talk about it, we dream about it, we daydream about it. I like to say, you know, I want things to be different, I just don't want to have to change. You know, so could you just
let somebody else change?
Could you fix it? Yeah. Could somebody else fix it? So part of the job is for us to be disturbed enough that we can't help but change. The pain of the status quo has got to be bad enough that you're willing to take a chance on something new, or else you just keep on coming back to the status quo. So we didn't get quite there yet. Every now and then we get there with race, and we do some window dressing, we do some band-aiding, we do some covering stuff up, and we try to make ourselves look a little better. And, you know, now we're in a big conversation about reparations. We're not interested in reparations, because reparations would mean deconstructing this society and starting over with a new system that included everybody as an equal human being, and we're not there yet. But we're going to talk about all this, and we put up these smoke screens. So that's why do you want to be well is the most essential question, because then it says, I'm willing to go for broke here, whatever it takes, I'm going to do it. I don't care how disturbed it's going to make me.
Well, don't you think there are just also especially among my community, the white community, that there are just so many people who don't know that they're not, when it comes to issues of race, they don't know that they're not well.
They don't know. That's right, because they've been totally insulated and had an opportunity to live in a white world, and it's a bubble. But they also, when they catch a glimpse of it, will be ready to die rather than change it, because it's comfortable. So we have to keep being disturbing people.
Is that the role of the center in some ways, or
Very,
are you all
very much so.
a burr in the saddle, so to speak?
Disruptor.
Disruptor.
That's what we
yeah.
need to be. You got to disrupt the narrative of we're okay. We're not okay. We're a racist society that's predicated upon the notion that some people are better than others. That's a bad notion, and we need to disrupt that story. And I'm committed to being a disruptor. Loving and kind and compassionate, and I will hold your hand and do all kinds of things, but I'll disrupt you with race. If you want to hold on to racism, you're going to be in the wrong place around me. You know, because it's indefensible. And it's certainly not defensible for anybody who, it's not even just about being a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim, it's about being a human being. You know, this is about being a human being that understands every human being is equal and valuable and has to be looked at that way. And as you were saying earlier, David, about then you have that sense inside yourself. And then when I encounter you, that's what I see. So I'm gonna deal with you differently than if I'm thinking of you as other. You know, you're a white man, you're Jewish or whatever. I don't know what we call you these days.
Used to be.
Yeah, okay. But that's beside the point, because you are a human being and there's something that we can find to connect us. And if you go out into the world with that notion, it changes the way you relate to everybody. You don't make judgments about people on the basis of anything except they're human. You can be living under the bridge and asking me for money to get dinner tonight, but you are a human being and you're a part of me. So how I deal with you has got to include that. And I best be careful about that, because if I quit doing that, then I'm dehumanizing myself. And we don't realize we're dehumanizing ourselves with racism and sexism and all that stuff. People don't realize how you're dehumanizing yourself. And white people don't know how wounded they are by racism. So they don't think it has anything to do with them. But they're very mistaken if you think you can stay in this world and hold on to those views and not be wounded. You have just not heard the truth. And I'm here to tell you, you're wounded. And Wendell Berry bears witness to this in his book, The Hidden Wound. If you've not read that book and you're white and don't think, if you're listening or you hear white people who think race doesn't have anything to do with them, I want to say you're wounded and you don't know it. And to the extent that you stay unconscious about it, you will not be fully who God put you on the earth to be. And you know, then you decide what you want to do with that. Do you want to fully be who God put you on the earth to be, or do you want to just kind of halfway get there, or you decided you don't care what God thinks? I don't know. You should interrogate those questions and see where you come out.
I saw a Washington Post article the other day, and the statistics that it listed, I don't know if you saw this, was just shocking for me. Said that 3/4 of African Americans are worried that they or someone they love will be physically attacked because they're black. And 7 out of 10 black Americans think at least half of white people hold white supremacist beliefs.
Yeah, well, that's 10 of just actually might be close to the truth.
I think you're absolutely right, but I think that's a shocking statistic and a very tragic statistic.
Yeah, but you know, let's don't confuse ourselves. It's always been true. I mean, so we wrote it down now, and we can be, but we didn't write it down 100 years ago. But it was even worse. So you know, so I'm not so worried about 2022. 2022 is pretty good actually compared to 1919. you know, when we killed thousands of black folks, just wholesale killed people. So in terms of race, we do have some better things to fall back upon in this era, because there is some effort to try to act like we care about what happens, and we have some recourse that we didn't have 100 years ago. But I have if you heard me preach yesterday, you saw my beautiful black sons. When my beautiful black sons leave the house, I don't feel as good as I do when I know they're in the house. You know, my son left from his godmother's house the other night and came back to the hotel, and then went to the movies here in DC. And I was wishing he hadn't done it. But I dare not say anything, because he's told me a long time ago he wasn't gonna live my fears. You know, so, and I respect him for not allowing himself to not do what he wants to do, not be free,
right,
because he lives in this country that doesn't really like him, so he goes anyway. But I was so much more comfortable when I got his little text message and he said, "I'm back in the room." You know, he's 36 years old, you know? And it's not because I don't trust my son, it's because, and I don't trust the environment not to be punitive toward him, because he happens to be a black man. And that's why reparations needs to be about creating a world that eliminates that place of having to be afraid. And until you speak to a process that can lead to that, then you're not having a conversation. You're just playing around, and I don't have any time for that, because I'm an old lady and I gotta get more done here, so. But it's you know.
Thank you.
We got a lot to do.
Yeah, amen to that.
Can I ask you about the last few years?
Pardon?
Can I ask you about the last few years?
Yeah.
I'm known around my newspaper as ridiculous, unrealistic optimist. And so one could say, first when we started Weave, I at least thought, well, obviously race is going to be part of our work, but it's not going to be the major. We're a community group.
Right.
And then when we got in the country, that was clear that was not going to happen. That race was going to be a major part of the work, because the levels of anger and injustice were just so sulfuric. You had to deal with what was in the room.
Right.
But I wonder if, having had those conversations, and a lot of people having had conversations in the last few years since Floyd especially, but since 2014, since Ferguson, am I right or am I wrong to think that there has been a change in conversation? And I'll give you one example, because I have to plug every Episcopal institution I was ever part of. For 23 years, I went to a summer camp called Incarnation Camp in Connecticut, an Episcopal camp, and it drew from New York City. And our camp was probably 65% white, 35% black. Mm-hmm. And so we went to camp from age 8, and we're now in our 50s and 60s, and we see each other several times a year.
You still meet?
I have 80 friends that knew me when I was 12.
Wow.
And we just had a funeral for one of our friends, and we all gathered. And I would say, of the black men and women in my inner circle friendship group there, since 2014, and especially since 2020, they show up in the room differently. And they're more direct and honest. And our conversations are different. Mm-hmm. And so, am I right or not to take solace in the events of the hopefully good outcome of evil events of the last few years?
I think you should take solace wherever you can. You know. So I can't comment on that, because you gotta take solace. You gotta stay hopeful. You gotta ward off despair. However you can do that. I do think that that the conversation has gotten in the white circles that I've worked in, which is a big group within the Episcopal Church. There's more awareness that race is not something we made up, or that if we quit talking about it, it'd go away. So I do think that a lot of folks have awakened a little bit differently, which is kind of weird, because, you know, George Floyd being murdered if that's when you woke up, you should not tell anybody, because somebody needs to wonder were you all those years before. But that is the case. I mean, people call me up and tell me that with such pride, Well, when George Floyd was murdered, where were you before 2020? Really? So I think that helped to change some of the conversation. But also there are a lot of African Americans anyway that are just tired of the whole thing. And younger African Americans that are pretty clear about, they don't really give a flying flip about what white folks believe. They're sick of white folks and the system, and they wish that they would vacate the planet. And if we could get some tickets to Wakanda, we'll go. And that's how they feel, because they've just had enough of it. And so then people like me has to keep saying, too many people have died to create a different kind of world for you to just check out. That's not one of your options. You don't get to just check out, because people died and left a legacy here that makes it possible for people like me to sit in this chair and be this person. And so I have a responsibility to be, to be true to that some kind of way. And so that's my response to that. But I do think that the more honest conversations, maybe at least in some circles, are happening. But then there's still an awful lot of people, black, white, and brown, that don't want to talk about any of it and don't want to be bothered. And I don't think that's an option. I don't think that's an option if we want to build, if we want to help heal the soul of this country. We're going to have to deal with race. Amen. Because it's the subtext of just about everything that's going on. And you spend a lot of time looking at subtext. So would you agree with that race is woven into it an awful lot?
It's the super text. It's not even sub. It's just right there.
Yeah. So we're gonna have to do it. And I wish that more people would stand up and proclaim, wherever you have a platform, whether it's church or newspaper or wherever, that we're gonna have to deal with this. So we might as well get on with it and stop playing these silly games like making a booger bear out of critical race theory, or making a booger bear out of somebody teaching real history, or trying to say, the 1619 Project needs to be banned. I mean, that's a bunch of idiocy. And we should be somewhere making so much noise about it until people could shut up, I mean, I really think that whole, just to say quickly, that whole critical race theory mess could have been nipped in the bud if the press had never let it get out of hand. Somebody has a conversation about this, and then you write about it, and then you get 15 talking heads talking about it, and you think,
it's my living.
How long could you? Well, that's why I'm hassling you about it. Why talk about this why support this false narrative? This is a law school issue, and I wrote a blog that said critical race theory is not coming to your elementary school, because no six-year-old needs to know about this, neither does his or her teacher. But we made it into a great big thing because it could become a thing. And I think we need to, in our communities, we need to start holding people more accountable for scaring us with stuff that we don't need to have to be scared about. And that to me was a really good example of how you just blow something all up out of all different kinds of proportions and make it into something that is the whole premise is so ridiculous until it's like, why are we still talking about this? It's like talking about, did you eat the bubble gum this morning, and we're gonna make a thing out of this, and maybe somebody's gonna get a Pulitzer if they keep writing about it. Don't you think it was ridiculous? Okay.
It fills the coffers of campaigns, though.
But can't we find a way to begin to say, you can't play with us like this.
We should, absolutely.
We've got serious stuff to talk about. We've got issues that need to be the subject of our writing and speaking. So if you want to play this game, you need to go play somewhere else, because we're not going to be in it. And I don't know how we do that, but too many of us are willing to just kind of be quiet or be, well, it'll go away eventually, or it's too much trouble, or we're tired of the whole thing. I don't know. I'm not sure about the answer. I just know I think we got to find some ways to stand against some of this if we intend to heal this place.
Well, let me ask a direct question to both of you. So you're sitting at home, or you're sitting out here, or you're sitting here, and you interested and want to make a contribution to rebuilding communities, to healing communities. What do we do? What is someone supposed to do? What is the best way to take part in or to support what Weave is trying to lift up, right? And what is the best way for us, especially white folks, to support or lift up the work that you're trying to do?
Well, this is where I plug our website, weareweavers.org. You can go and join and become a member and help us. But I would say the idea of Weave is that relationships don't scale because they're so slowly built, but norms scale. If we can shape the norms of how one is supposed to behave, then you can have a vast cultural change very quickly, and vast behavioral changes, littering, smoking, Me Too. These are big cultural shifts that happen slowly, and then all at once. And so one of the things you can do is you can say, we have somebody here who says, I practice aggressive friendship. I'm the person in the neighborhood who invites people over. And who organizes the outings. I have another friend here who lives on Capitol Hill who says, I value people who are lingerable, who will linger. And that's like a good norm to have. Yeah. The bishop and I were involved in a community of DC kids, and we just had dinner every Thursday night with a group of young people. And it was so much fun. And it was just and we got to know a whole different population, different generations. And then there are some people who are going to start big organizations or work or volunteer. One of my favorite organizations is called Thread in Baltimore, where they surround underperforming kids in Baltimore City schools with volunteers, what they call head of family. And so the kids suddenly have this extended family. And the kids want to rebel because most of their relationships have betrayed them. And the rule of Thread is you can't leave. It's like family. And so they keep showing up, and unless the kid gets a court order, the volunteers will keep showing up. And the head of Thread, Sarah Heminger, says, when somebody shows up for you after you've rejected them, it's identity changing. And it's identity changing to be the one rejected and still show up. Another of my favorite organizations is run by a gentleman sitting over there named Mac McCarter. He's part of the Byrd High School of Shreveport, Louisiana contingent over there with John, his neighbor. They went to this high school, this great high school in Shreveport, which according to Mac, 80% of the Nobel Prize laureates went to their high school. But it desegregated in the worst possible way, and I'm sure Mac would be happy to talk, which without addressing the underlying realities, and Shreveport became a divided city. And so Mac, with others, created this thing called Community Renewal International, which basically, if you go to Shreveport and you drive around, you'll see people with signs on the front yards that say, "We care." You'll see people with the lapel pin Mac is wearing that says, "We care." If you go into certain neighborhoods, they're basically settlement houses, communal families for the kids in the neighborhoods, launching them off into a different future. And so Mac and Sarah Heminger are like, they've done it big time. Just amazing organizations. But all of us can do it little time. And it's literally the act of inventing a technology of convening, some way to get people together. And it can be a dinner table, it can be, we were talking about knitting, whatever it is, it's some pretext to get people together. And anybody can do that.
Yeah, and I think in terms of race, white people need to get over themselves and start really realizing that they have been told a lie about superiority, and then to go out into the world to see other people as their equals and see then who comes into your circle. You know, when I go to Episcopalians in the room know that Episcopal churches many of them are mostly white. And they'll say to me, well, we can't really do this work because we don't have people of color. And I say, well, you're up against it because you can't rent any. You know, you're gonna have to figure out something. You know, if you haven't built relationships where you have people of color in your circle, that's why they're not in your life. So they're not gonna just show up next week because you all woke up and decided you needed to do something. So where then do you start? And you start with the basic notion that all these people that are different from me, that have external differences, are human beings created in God's image, and I can relate to them as I seek to do that. And then you've got to turn your intention toward doing something different, being different, opening up to the possibility that other folks will come into your circle different from you. And you can then get in your car and drive yourself to a neighborhood where everybody's not white. You can go shop in another grocery store. You can put yourself in communities that don't look like yours if you really mean to change. And it's inconvenient, so you've got to decide if you're willing to be inconvenienced. You've got to decide if you're willing to deal with your fear. You know, you can't be grabbing your pocketbook every time you see a black man if you're gonna go shop in another area. I mean, there's so many personal things that you can do. One of my priest friends talked about developing a practice of courage. Every day you can decide to take a step to be a little bit more courageous, to get outside of the box you've been painted into for your life. So it may be today you go sit in a restaurant and eat, go to a Starbucks that's got some different kinds of folks there. That may be the first thing you can do. Maybe you just go through the drive-through to see if you can make it, you know, can you make it through the drive-through without somebody shooting you? Because folks tell me in North Atlanta, well, we can't come downtown. I said, why? What's wrong with downtown? It's dangerous. Well, what's dangerous? Well, it's just dangerous. So, well, you know, I drove through downtown to get here. Nobody, you know, the story in your head. So if you can drive through Starbucks and live, then maybe you can get up enough courage to go sit in the Starbucks and get yourself a cup of coffee. And then you might be able to go and talk to somebody that looked different from you. You know, this might sound ridiculous, but this is a good formula if you're sitting in your all-white enclave, scared to death of people who don't look like you, but worried that you need to do something better. And I think there are a lot of folks caught in that. It's not right, we're uneasy, we need to do something, but we don't know where to start. You take these tiny little steps. Tiny little steps. Don't come flying to the black neighborhood to run a soup kitchen. We don't want you there until you have at least made it through the Starbucks without thinking you're gonna get shot. Because all you're gonna do is bring your paranoia and fears, and we don't need it because we've already got enough problems. So please don't bring your neurosis. You know, so go work on it somewhere else. I'm serious about this.
I never thought of the drive-thru as a tool for racial reconciliation.
It's a good starting place. If you're sitting somewhere shaking in your shoes, but let's put it at a higher level. It is the practice of developing courage. You see, because courage will get you a long ways down the road with intention. If you've got courage and intention, it'll push you somewhere. But if you're just sitting somewhere with guilt and worry, and even some intention but no courage, you're just gonna keep sitting there. Anywhere. And you're gonna be in despair about it, and you're gonna be pitiful, and you're gonna be a bigger problem. So you can quit being a problem by just getting up and taking some tiny step. And you take another tiny step, and you take another, and one of these days, you wake up and you're somewhere that surprises you. And if you look back behind you, you see this trail of how you got there. I think that, we could start with David White. Is my favorite poet, and he talks about do the first thing first, not the second, not the third, the first thing, the thing you don't want to do. So if you're scared, if you're sitting somewhere scared to drive through downtown Atlanta, then you need to drive through downtown Atlanta. That would be a good place for you to start. Can you drive through downtown Atlanta and get somewhere? I make white churches go into predominantly black churches for dismantling racism training, because that's where I scheduled them. And they grumble because they don't want to drive. Well, can't we just have it in our church? No, you need to drive across town. And then they drive across town and they go to the predominantly black church and they go through the class and nothing happens to them. And then they come back and they say, that was the best experience I ever had. I say, well, you could have had it a long time ago. That church has been there for 30 years. So I know it almost sounds simple-minded, but it's not simple-minded, because fear is irrational. And to deal with fear, you have to start somewhere little. And I will be willing to support you in your little start, but you got to get your butt up and start. You can't just sit someplace with the lament.
Well, I think that's very good. I think some of the most direct, simple advice is the best. So I think that's right on. Let's take a moment. Oh, there you are, right there. So we want to turn and get some questions from both folks here and folks with us online.
So this is our first attempt at doing a hybrid conversation where we're going to take some questions here and some questions from online. So I'm going to read a question from our online crew, and then I'm going to come out there, and I see a hand up over here. So I'm going to go there first, and then I'm going to come to this side of the room, and I'll take somebody from over here. And then I'm going to come back to the online crew. So let's see how this works. I appreciate your graciousness as we get this
given
going.
the way this conversation goes, you may not get more than one question in.
Fair enough.
Oh, well.
And I am grateful to Margaret Rawls, who's our associate, who is monitoring the chat and pulling these questions from online. So thank you, Margaret. Okay, so first question. This one actually riffs off of, Dr. Meeks, what you were just talking about. So white folks building connections with people of color, with black folks, particularly being able to do that. And the question that came in has to do with white folks talking to their kin, right? With white folks talking to their kin, their friends, their families, others, about the question of race. And if either or both of you want to weigh in on, how does that work? We ought to be doing it, sure, but what gets in the way that you have seen that people can overcome? Is this learnable? Is this something that white folks can actually figure out how to do more of in ways that are helpful? Because white folks talking to each other isn't always helpful, right? So,
David, you have to start because you're
No,
white.
I don't have a good answer, so I'm praying you're going to start.
Well, I'll start. You don't have to pray. It's been answered.
I could pray too.
You can pray and I'll talk, okay? You can talk to anybody you decide you want to talk to. And talking to somebody in your family about coming to some understanding of human beings all being human, it seems to me a very good conversation. And if you can't do that, I think you have to ask yourself, what is the nature of the relationship you've got in the first place? It does not have to be you trying to beat somebody up. You have to ask people questions and speak out of spaces of curiosity, and don't go with judgment and superiority. I woke up and I discovered a little bit of truth, and now I'm going to beat you up with it. That's not going to work. You have to get into the conversation in some kind of way that makes sense, and it has to do with the relationships. I can't really truly answer that question for that person, because that person has to decide how much courage do I have, how many risks do I want to take, and the reason why we can't talk about some stuff is because we just don't want to have to feel bad or worry about what the responses are going to be. So you got to decide. It comes back a lot to courage. I keep on coming back to, we are having a crisis of courage in this country, individually, personally, collectively, and you have the courage to bring up stuff. But you gotta have some compassion and some sense and not be dogmatic about it, I think. And loving. And none of us is perfect. None of us has all the answers. We're all broken people looking for the bandage closet. If you have that attitude, it changes everything.
I think it's also really helpful in white families. I know it's been helpful in generations of my family gathered together to have conversations about, especially from the older members of the family, what they were taught about race when they were young.
Yeah.
And what they have learned over their lifetime.
Right.
And the journey they have made. And to have that conversation from generation to generation, I think can be a very powerful, sometimes scary conversation.
Which gets into curiosity. And storytelling is a wonderful way to do that, as I'm sure you have found, because when people are telling stories, it's your story. It's your story. And there's no judgment. How are you going to judge the story? It's your story. It's just, and you just tell it. And then we can talk about how your story impacts with me and how I feel. So, but that's probably enough about that.
I would say first, this, like how you ask questions when it comes time to ask questions. Like, don't ask what do you believe.
Right.
Ask how did you come to believe that.
Right.
And that's why they tell us. You get somebody to tell a story of a belief. Right. Or there's a good phrase in good conversation: make them authors, not witnesses.
Say that again?
Make them authors, not witnesses. Because when people are telling you about their lives, they don't go into enough detail. And so if you can say, well, where was your boss when he said that to you? Then they're narrating it, and then you get a richer version of the experience they just had. And I guess the couple things I would say, and one, just for white folks, one thing I've learned is you don't know. Like I grew up in an integrated school, integrated neighborhood. I think, oh, I've been in integrated settings all my life. But there are still things you don't know. Yeah. And so what you were saying about the assumption of physical insecurity, as we learned fresh again, it's just hazardous to be black in America. And so, what is that insecurity? How does that feel every day? And even if you grew up in an integrated setting and you could say, oh, I've got 9 million black friends at work, but you don't know. And so there's a different experience. The second thing is, I feel weird talking about this as white advice to whitey. People don't always want to become billboards for an issue. And people just want to be friends sometimes. And they don't want to be ambassador of some issue. And so being sensitive to that, I find that there's some insensitivity to that. And then finally just showing up in being normal.
Yeah.
Normalcy, there's a lot to be said for it. And what you said, first things first. We're going to settle the big issues later, but somebody said to get somebody to trust you, you walk up to them like you're approaching a deer in the forest. You're patient and you're gentle and you're not filled with self-will.
Right. And you're not trying to be a voyeur.
Yeah.
You really are interested. I mean, if I say hello to you in the grocery store, how are you? I really want you to say how you are, or I wouldn't have asked you. Yeah. And that's all that's necessary. You don't have to tell me, anything about yourself. What's it like to be a white man with gray hair and little glasses? You don't have to get into all that. You can just say hello.
I'll
That'll
tell you
work.
The truth. I'm looking for the dill. Where do they keep the dill?
Question from the audience, please.
Well, I'm grateful to both of you. Thank you. I appreciate you both. My question is, what would you say are the strengths and vulnerabilities in each of your characters? And while you're thinking about that, whether you're going to answer it or what the answer is, I just want to say I think it's useful to think about the strengths, tremendous strengths in our country, as well as the vulnerabilities that those strengths have led to. The production of the Second World War, the incredible problem solving. You talk to an immigrant down on 14th Street, what do you like about this country? What's the problem? I have a job. They're thrilled to be here. So your answer to the question.
Can you repeat the question, Michelle, as you heard it?
What's
Our
our
strengths
character
and vulnerabilities in your characters.
You mean personally? Yeah, well, we don't have enough time to talk about that.
My great strength is my great humility. And my weakness, the one I'm willing to talk about, is I too often value time over people, which is to say I've got a clock running in my head that I need to get this done. Like when I stop to pump gas in my car, I think, okay, I could get 2 emails done while I'm doing this. And so I've got this clock in my head saying, oh, you got to get off to the next thing. And so I suck at lingerability. And so that's something I really work on.
Sort of being in the present.
Yeah, but like, and not wanting to rush off. Like productivity can be a terrible taskmaster.
Yeah.
Especially if you feel overcommitted, as so many of us do. And I do, you know, I'm a kid of immigrants. We were bred, and our experience is different from some of the other experiences, but was raised with a fervent love of America, and still think it's merited, along with shame and embarrassment about parts of America. But you know, my great uncle was a silent film director. And in those days, they made movies at the beach in Atlantic City. And he made Westerns. His name was Irving Browning. And if you went into his apartment in Morningside Heights, New York, it looked like you were going to Montana in 1860. Because he had these rifles, he had leather, he had saddles, he had lassos, the cowboy gear of all kinds. That guy never went west of the Hudson River in his life. But he had an image of what America was. It was like lone cowboys, you know.
Wow.
And so that fervor for this country, even though he didn't have the social courage to really experience it, but that fervent love for the land, at least as he imagined it to be, was certainly passed down.
The idea of Americans.
Yeah. For me, it's hope. My mother taught me that tomorrow's another day and you never know what's going to happen. And I guess I ascribe to Sojourner Truth's notion that if God is not dead, there's a reason for hope. And I think God hasn't died yet anyway. And the vulnerability is, I care too deeply. And it can be debilitating sometimes to carry the weight of the wounding in myself. And that's part of why I have arthritis. I understand that, you know, that carrying too much, learning how to let it go and figuring out what's mine and what belongs to other people.
Getting well.
Is about getting well. And it's, you know, I'm 76 years old, I've made great progress, and I intend to keep on making great progress, but it's important to be, I'd rather err on the side of caring than on the side of not caring, so. And I think, you know, this country, I live here. I've been in a few other places. I live here. There's some good things about being here. There's a whole bunch of crap about being here. And I'm willing to name both sides of the coin, honestly, and don't feel like I have to apologize for what I see as what's wrong, either in the country or myself.
Amen.
Thank you both for your honesty in that question. So I've got a question here, I've got a question online, and then I've got a question on that far side over there. So we got to get through at least 3 more in the next 10 minutes.
All right, we're doing pretty good.
I'd like to thank all of you for this very thoughtful conversation. And my question is,
I bet the folks in the back, can you hear her in the back? Stand up. Stand up so they can hear you in the back. It won't matter. It won't? Okay.
how do you think churches should lead the way in offering more opportunities to build friendship, as you say, David, and to teach kindness and caring to people of all ages?
I'll go first since I'm the new arrival here. Christian formation. I have a friend who was asking about why so many young people are leaving the church. And he concluded it's not because they think they don't believe what the church teaches. It's because they think we don't believe what the church teaches. Yeah. And I've been doing a lot of work in the evangelical world, and all the pastors complain, well, I only get them for an hour or two a Sunday. Fox News gets them 6 hours a night. And I say, well, it's not that the Fox News Klieg lights are so bright, it's that the candle of Christian formation is so dim. And one of my pastor friends, he started sprinkling bits from Sermon on the Mount into his sermons without saying where they came from. And people would come up to him afterwards and said, I didn't like that part. That was too woke. That was too woke. And so I think Jesus is a way. He's not just a word, he's a way. And if you talk about Jesus in his actual context as this radical presence who, I'm going to say it because I passed, I gave a talk about Jesus the Jew at that pulpit. And when you look at him through the Jewish lens, as a guy who comes out of Galilee at a time of revolution and power structure, and he disrupts every power structure all at once. And you look at him and you think, what a total badass. And I was too afraid to use the word badass when I gave the sermon, but he was. Yeah. And so there's no improving on that message. And so I would say the skills of Christian formation.
And I would say practice. The reason why people don't believe we believe what we say is because of the way we behave. And so we need to practice what we preach in a different way so that it's clearer, because people believe what they see. You know, Maya Angelou said that people will remember how you made them feel a long time after they have forgotten what you said to them. So if you come into a place and people practice kindness, kindness needs to be the way of life in the community. And if it's not, then you can talk about it all you want to. You can talk about being a radical follower of Jesus all you want to, too, and go hide under bed every time a political issue comes up that you need to stand up for, and nobody's going to believe you believe any of that stuff. So we just got to decide what we're going to. If you don't believe what you're preaching, you need to preach something you believe, because otherwise nobody's going to believe what you said. So, and I think that's part of the problem. We've been preaching a lot of stuff we don't believe, because if we really believed it, we'd be a completely different people.
And I want to say, I think Jan's question is a great question, but how absolutely tragic we have to ask that question. I mean, the very purpose of the church is to build sacred, God's loving community. I mean, that's really part of what we're supposed to be doing. And so to have to ask that question of ourselves, what do we do to do that, is sad for me. It's true.
We have to ask it because there's such an absence of practice. And this doesn't cost us anything. It's not that hard to do. We don't need a bigger budget. We don't need more folks in the pew. We just need to change. We need a conversion. We need a new way to see. And we're supposed to be doing that every Sunday, reminding ourselves about the new way to see. So, you know, I'm a big proponent of, if you don't really believe it, stop talking about it until you do, and then try to go out every day and do the stuff you really believe that makes some sense. That's the good stuff. Hopefully you're not gonna be doing bad stuff. But because that's what people, that's what people will remember. And it'll have an impact upon the lives of people, to see genuine, authentic stuff.
I'm going to step in here because the question that I want to ask from the online crew is a follow-on to this. And I know both of you work with young people. So the question is from Lynn, what about young people outside of religious institutions, especially those outside of Judaism or Christianity? How do we work with young people in that space?
My son grew up as an Episcopalian, and he hasn't set foot in a church in I don't know how long. And he's got a lovely community of the festival goers. They're gonna, right now, this afternoon we were talking about the next festival he's going to in Michigan, where they come together, they camp, they love each other, they'll give each other their last nickel. They are more church than most of the churches that are gonna meet next Sunday morning. And half of them probably don't even know what the Bible is. So I think that we need to be better at paying attention to loving, kind people wherever we find them, and people searching for that gift. And if we live our lives right, they might want to ask us something about why we think the way we do, but they might be teaching us something that would be good for us to know too. Because when I hang out with my son and his friends, I like them a whole lot better sometimes than some of the folks I hang out with in those structures that we have put steeples on and called churches. So, and we need to tell that truth. We need to stop acting like that there's a subspecies out here of some folks that come in our buildings. We need to learn how to be gracious and loving toward every single solitary human being and affirm their worth and appreciate them for what they bring to the table. And then if we think we've got something good to share, let's share it, but let's try to make sure we don't try to make them feel like what they are is sub something because of what we have. Because, you know, I love that those young folks love my child the way they do.
Amen.
You know, he's got a community that works for him, and it's wonderful. And, you know, watched him take communion yesterday, and he crossed himself. I said, he still remembers? You know, I was really glad to see that. But it doesn't matter to me, because the thing that matters to me, does he have people in his life that love him and will be good to him and will walk? What I tell them is, you got to find people who will walk over hot coals for you. Those are the people that you need to call friends. Those are the people you need to count on. And these are people that would walk over hot coals for each other. And
David,
that
you wanna
is
jump in
important.
on this one before we get to the last one?
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, I've been teaching for 20 years college, and because I'm me, I go to dinner with faculty members at about 6:30, and then I have office hours at a bar at 9:30. And I've been doing this for 20 years. And I have never had a moment where my faculty dinner was more fun than my office hours with the students.
Yeah.
They're just faster, they're funnier,
Yeah.
they're not pompous Ivy League professors. And so, yeah, I guess I'd say a few things. One is be open about mental health. My students are way more morally passionate than they were 10, 15 years ago. They're way more, they have way more mental health issues about which they're very honest. And then the final thing I've learned is, I don't care how many parents they need more parents. They're always willing to accept someone in their life who shows them some unconditional regard and is willing to have conversations with them about issues that the gigantic issues of their life that they're in the middle of wrestling with. Whether it's how to pick a vocation, how to pick a marriage, how to pick a faith or a philosophy, how to build community. These are gigantic issues and upon which they've been given very few resources. And so having conversations on that stuff, it makes for just very fun conversations.
Without judgment and without prescription.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, very last question. We're going to squeeze you in under the wire.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, Mr. Brooks, as you were speaking, you said that you took solace in the fact that some of your African-American friends were showing up differently in your group. And I was a bit startled by that because I suspect that they are not taking solace as they speak up more, but they have more of a sense of the building being on fire. And my question to both of you is, do you actually believe the building is on fire? Because if the building of this country is on fire, no other conversation is relevant except how to put the fire out. Yeah. And I think many black people believe in this country now that maybe white people might get it, given that the murders are now being videotaped, that the country is on fire. And so we are trying to speak more directly to it. So I'd like to ask each of you, do you believe the country is on fire? And if so, how do we begin to put out the fire?
It's on fire, and it's been on fire all the time, is what I think. So it's just that the blazes are being maybe photographed differently, but you know, racism is an energy system, and it's been here all the time, undermining us and messing us up. It just has different iterations, and this iteration maybe worries us more. I don't know why, really, because in some ways, a few things are a little bit better. So the house is on fire, but the house has been on fire. The house was on fire in 1919 in Red Summer. The house was on fire when 800 and something people were being lynched in Georgia. People being dragged out of their houses and taken off and killed for reasons that nobody could really name. So just because we saw one man get murdered on television, all of a sudden we've got this notion that something different has happened. It's been happening all the time, and 1,000 people have been killed by police since George Floyd, and you don't know the names of most of them because we just forgot about it after we didn't see them on television. So, sir, I think the house has been on fire since we started with slavery in this country, and we just are needing to remember that. And we should have been acting differently for a long time. So for me, it's not new. I'm not any more exercised today after George Floyd's murder than I was 10 years ago, because the stuff is just not any better. So I would like for people to stand still a minute and get a grip and really think about how do we get to this day? But you can't just erase all that history and wake up and think just because George Floyd was murdered on television during COVID and we were all at home and saw it, we got outraged. We should have been outraged all the time, just as outraged as we were then. But we saw something that scared us. And, so I don't have a lot of patience with that. When people call me up, foaming at the mouth about George Floyd, I'd say, sit yourself down, be still, and listen to what you need to do, and stop having a knee-jerk reaction, because that knee-jerky stuff is just going to get you to try to put a Band-Aid on this cancer so you can be comfortable again. And that's the whole point. Can I find a place of comfort? No, you can't, because you never should have been able to find a place of comfort, because nothing is that different. Little children are dying in this country because they don't have good health care, they don't have good food, they don't have good education. People are living under bridges. Too many people are in prison. When did that get to be news? It's been happening forever, for a long, long time. So I just want us to stop having this reaction and really just get to work.
Thank you. I'm going to let David have a chance to answer because we're running over, but thank you, Catherine.
I don't really have a lot to add to that. I agree 100%. Just on the one thing on whether the conversations have changed, these are people I've known for 50 years. And so I've asked them, do you perceive a change?
Yeah.
And, we lost a member of our tight friendship circle, and we all were at the funeral. And one of them, it was one of my friends, a black friend, he was so close to the guy who died, he just wept through the whole reception.
Yeah.
And so that's a sign of real friendship.
Yeah.
And across race.
Yeah. And
that happens. I asked him, we went out for drinks because that's what we do. He said, I'm just not code switching anymore. And so I take that as a sign of
he's just not what?
Code switching.
Yeah.
And so he's just not going to do it anymore.
Yeah.
And so I take that as a sign of honesty. And so I agree the house is on fire, but there are a lot of human beings like you trying to put it out.
That's right. And you, David. I mean, we're all trying to put anybody who's getting on the path and struggling for truth and trying to tell the truth is trying to help put the house out. And I accept that as a wonderful thing, and I'm glad about it. I just don't think we can be naive about the fact that the house is burning.
Right.
And I just want to say to both of you who are doing such excellent work, and thank you for that work, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
And my thanks to everybody who joined us online. Thank you for being with us. And in the vein that David mentioned, his pastor friend, I'm going to sprinkle some words of Jesus in here and send you all home. So, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. For the measure you give will be the measure you receive. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit be with you this night and always. Amen.